Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies weekly lecture series. My name is Joanna Krongold, and together with Professor Naomi Seidman, I am the course instructor for the Jewish Studies Graduate Seminar here at the center. I'm delighted to be introducing today's talk entitled Getting Their Act Together, the Formation of an Asylum-Seeking Community in Israel. Given that today's topic is so bound up with issues of displacement, I think that it is especially important for all of us to consider and acknowledge the displacement, erasure, and genocide of many Indigenous peoples from the land on which we currently live and work. The University of Toronto exists and operates on land seized by settlers from many Indigenous groups, including the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Not only is this land the traditional territory of these and other Indigenous groups, it also continues to be a home to a diverse range of Indigenous peoples. And that interaction between the past and the present, the traditional and the contemporary, seems to me to be crucial when acknowledging the land and its caretakers. I think there's a way in which certain language seems to cast Indigenous peoples as part of a past that is now over, something that doesn't have a connection to the present day hustle and bustle of the city. Many of us who have settled here in Canada, whether recently or generations back, are preoccupied with our own homes, our families, clean air, clean water, the rights to live healthy, happy, and free lives. And I think part of these land acknowledgements should be to also acknowledge that many Indigenous peoples don't have access to those necessities today. This is a living issue. It is ongoing, pressing, and vital, not something solely located in the past. When land, cultures, rights, and people are stolen, we must begin by recognizing and naming it, especially in academic spaces that promote critical inquiry, inclusivity, and the broadening of intellectual perspectives. This is perhaps particularly significant for those of us who work in the field of Jewish studies. Many of our areas of scholarship concern questions of homeland, questions of belonging, diaspora, violence, genocide, commemoration, and language. These are issues that are directly relevant, as I think we're going to learn from the talk today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two speakers for the day, Dr. Oded Oron and Noureldin or Nouri Musa. Dr. Oded Oron is an educator, community organizer, and migration expert. He holds a PhD from the University of Washington in international studies with a focus on forced migration. Oded grew up in Israel and worked for 7 years in leading news outlets, as well as the press unit in Israel's Prime Minister's office. He previously worked as the assistant director of Cornell Hillel, where among his responsibilities, he led immersive educational trips to Israel and the Palestinian Authority for groups of campus student leaders. He currently works as the manager of data, research, and evaluations at the Jewish Immigrant Aid Society, Toronto, a Jewish nonprofit serving newcomers of all backgrounds and supporting their integration in Canada. He is also an assistant professor at U of T, teaching classes in political science and Jewish studies. Noureldin or Nouri Musa grew up in Darfur, Sudan, and fled his home country in 1999 during the Civil War. After living in Libya temporarily, Nouri arrived in Israel in search of asylum in May 2005, crossing from the Sinai Desert in Egypt. He worked in a pastry kitchen in one of the hotels in the Dead Sea and served as a community organizer for other asylum seekers who arrived in the country under similar circumstances. As part of the escalation against the asylum seekers community in Israel, he was sent to the Holot Detention Center in 2014. While in detention, he joined a theater group facilitated by Dr. Chen Alon, whose purpose was to mediate the story of the asylum seekers to Israeli society and use art to reflect about their personal struggle and mobilization efforts to be recognized as refugees. Since 2018, Nouri has been living in Canada with his wife, also a refugee from Darfur, and their 2 daughters who were born in Canada. Now, before I hand this talk over to Oded and Nouri, I'd like to just remind you that, as many of you know, the lecture is part of the CJS graduate seminar. So after we hear the talk, we're going to take just a quick break of a few minutes And then our speakers will be joining the class in person for a live Q&A. At that point, students and members of the public will have the opportunity to pose questions and comments to our speakers. So now I'd like to very warmly welcome Oded Oron and Nouri Musa and pass the microphone over to them. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Joanne, and thank you, the Tannenbaum Center, for inviting us to this lecture series. We're very happy to be here and speak about a topic that's dear to our heart and that we've been engaged with for many years. For me, from an academic perspective mostly, as well as some community, and for Nouri as a lived experience, which we'll talk about as this talk progresses. This issue has received a lot of domestic and international attention, but I think that one part that is less highlighted is actually the story of the Cholot theater that we're going to talk about today. We're trying to make sure that the focus of the conversation focuses on the Cholot theater, but we understand that not everyone shares the background about the situation as a whole. So the first part will be the part that I'll present some general information about Israel's immigration system, about its asylum regime, about the unexpected arrival rather, of African asylum seekers to Israel. And then I'm going to hand it off to Nouri to speak more from his lived experience and focus again on the work that he did as part of the theater. So first I'm going to check that my share screen is working properly and you can all see my presentation, hopefully. All right, hopefully it is working. So every sovereign nation has the right to decide how it's like to design its immigration policy. And usually that policy is reflective of its character, of its values. And in that regard, Israel is like every other country. And Israel was born, as you know, historically, to serve as the homeland for Jewish people returning to that homeland according to its perception. And its migration policy was very simple. If you are Jewish, and Jewish is defined by being born to a mother who is Jewish or having converted to Judaism, and you do not actively practice a different religion, you can receive the right to become an Israeli citizen and immigrate to the country. The law was created in context after the horrors of the Holocaust and accelerated the arrival of people who were persecuted and were looking for safety, mainly within a Jewish context. And for many, many years, that policy was unchallenged. I want to talk about some of the reasons why this policy was unchallenged. In its early decades, Israel was a young, underdeveloped country, had poor economic performance and conditions. It was engaged in ongoing conflict internally as well as with its neighbors. It has a very centralized, closed economy, and all of that was in the pre-globalization era. So when we try to talk about the people, the waves of immigration that characterized the arrival to Israel during those years, again, reflecting that strong undertoning of a Jewish sentiment, we're looking at mainly Holocaust survivors from Europe and Jews from the Middle East and North Africa in the first decade. Then after 1967, that slightly branched out to more United States and former Soviet Union Jews, but that was the first wave. These were more educated and very Zionist Jews that came as a result of the country's growth and expansion. In the 1990s, Israel saw a dramatic arrival of close to 20% of its population growing by the arrival of former Soviet Union Jews after the Iron Curtain and after the Soviet Union era was completed, and a small fraction of several tens of thousands of Ethiopian Jews also coming around the same time. Again, if you look at the first 4 decades, we're seeing that Israel's migration policy was unchallenged and very much mimicked its values and purpose. That has changed in the mid-1990s, where non-Jewish migration for the first time started coming first in the form of foreign workers and later, as we'll see today, in the form of asylum seekers. I want to give brief context to why Israel all of a sudden saw the arrival of foreign workers. Israel in the mid-90s was engaged in the Oslo Accords with the Palestinian Authority. And as part of that agreement and the beginning of a separation between the two peoples, more of a stark separation, the Palestinian workforce that has received for many, many years the opportunity to work in Israel and the Israeli economy dependent on so very much, all of a sudden was barred from entering Israel, and Israel, with its growing population of now Jewish newcomers and labor shortages created by the lack of permits of Palestinian workers, find itself with the need to import migrant workers from a whole host of countries to serve as custodians, caregivers, and many, many other professions that usually are low skilled and low paid within the Israeli economy. Again, Israel has all of a sudden found itself in the same company of many other developed nations of visa overstayers, of issues of labor exploitations due to the visa of the foreign worker being tied to the employer, and a stigmatization of certain professions like caregivers, dishwashers, custodians, and so on, who became completely synonymous with these foreign laborers, and Israelis would simply not do these jobs. A phenomenon, by the way, that continues until today. So that was a full stop about foreign workers. So what is it? How is it connected to asylum seekers? What has changed and what is going on? In terms of asylum, Israel was an early drafter and signatory to the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, a convention that pretty much legislates or provides the guidelines for countries to understand what is the definition of an asylum seeker, of a refugee, and how a country should be treating and dealing with people who claim asylum successfully. Interestingly enough, while the Knesset, the Parliament of Israel, has never incorporated the convention into Israeli domestic law, like usually is done by many countries who are signatory to the convention, Israeli courts do recognize the convention as binding in their rulings, and that will become relevant as this talk progresses. In a nutshell, you need to understand that from an asylum perspective, every time that Israel has engaged its right to provide protection for folks, it was usually within the Jewish context. And if it was outside of the Jewish context, it was never part of an organized procedure, but rather based on a set of anecdotal cases like I've listed here. In 1979, the issues of the Vietnamese people, the boat people. In 1993, a handful, several dozens of Bosnians that came as a result of the war in Yugoslavia. In the early 2000s, after Israel pulled out of southern Lebanon, it gave status to those in the southern Lebanese army who were loyal to Israel and fought alongside the IDF. And between 2002 and 2005, group protection was given to about 2,500 foreign nationals from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Liberia, Ivory Coast, just to name a few. But temporary protection, you need to understand, is something that after the situation stabilizes in a given country, the people are expected to go back to that country. If you wish to think of a very current example, you can think of the Ukraine crisis and the US's or Canada's response, or if you think about the earthquake in Haiti, again, people were given a temporary protection in the United States, and after a few years were expected to go back. To summarize, in essence, there was never a real intention or need to actually go and establish something that is more organized in terms of an asylum process. And why is that? If we look at UNHCR's own data from 1975 until 2005, for 30 years, there were less than 5,000 asylum requests. Some of them are lumped within the numbers that I just gave about a minute ago. And as you can see, UNHCR was the sole entity responsible for processing the request and making the recommendation for the state of Israel to accept the people as refugees after their asylum process has continued. This is an important point because most developed nations usually incorporated the asylum procedure into law and took full ownership and responsibility. But because it was pretty negligible in terms of scale, Israel just chose to deposit the process in the hands of the UNHCR and simply be the one finally giving the final authorization after one's process has been completed and received status. Everything started changing in 2005. Nouri, when he'll get to speak in a few minutes, will tell you about his personal story. But starting in 2005, groups of people, because of the war in Darfur, came from Darfur, the Nuba Mountains, and then Blue Nile, as well as South Sudan, and made the journey from Eritrea a country known notoriously as the North Korea of Africa, because they were able to make their way to Egypt, and Egypt, who shares a land border with Israel, a land border that was pretty open and notoriously known for human smuggling and in other bad contexts, made the way into Israel slightly easier, and that became a valid option for people who were seeking asylum and fleeing for their lives. You need to understand that in the early days, between 2005 and 2008, if you look at the different media reports about asylum seekers, their framing was as such. People were treated as African migrants, asylum seekers, refugees. Although these are legal definitions, in popular media, they were used interchangeably and quite favorably. It was not until 2009, 2010, when, as you can see, the numbers in direct correlation started going in really a sharp increase of the number of entrants, that the issue became political, became confusing. It caught Israel completely unprepared. And with that conflated with the fact that a more right-wing leaning government was elected in Israel, the conversation has shifted, and the people were no longer spoken about as asylum seekers, but rather they were looked at as infiltrators and illegal job seekers. We're seeing a whole change in framing and understanding of this community, despite the fact that the motivations and the circumstances remained the same. Again, strong correlation between the high numbers, a change of government, and as a result, a change of policy. While may not be reflective of Israeli society as a whole, and we'll get to that later, especially when Nouri gets to talk to you about the response of the Israeli public, the Israeli government, for its part, has taken a series of very aggressive policies to try and curb and completely stop the arrival of asylum seekers to its territory. First, it amended an old law from 1954 known as the Prevention of Infiltration Act that was at the time supposed to stop terrorists coming from neighboring Arab countries into Israel. They used the same punitive measures that are bound into the law, but applied them now to asylum seekers because technically some of them, for example, those who come from Sudan, Darfur, belong to an enemy state, which allowed them to exercise this more aggressive type of policy. Second, and in my personal, probably the least controversial measure, a border that was neglected for a very long time, that had a very weak fence and only pretty much was reliant on natural barriers to stop people from coming in, received a heavy investment in manpower and finances, and Israel was committed to building a 150-mile, roughly 240-kilometer fence along the border with Egypt, and that fence has proved to be very effective, because as of 2013, we see no new entrants of people through the southern borders. In 2009, Israel decided to take ownership of the asylum process and completely took it out of the hands of UNHCR, but as a deliberate policy, decided to stall the asylum process to gain more time, and again, to try and frame the issue not as an asylum issue. It sanctioned work and denied work permits for asylum seekers, a practice that is not really common if you compare what rights and benefits asylum seekers get while their case is pending in comparison to other Western and developed nations. And it opened the Cholot Detention Center, which will be very much a focus of our talk today. Finally, a final measure, Israel has exercised what they call the third country option. According to international law, and as we've mentioned, Israel is a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention, a country cannot, due to the principle of non-refoulement, forcibly remove someone back to a place where they'll be persecuted and might face death. So Israel was trying to find a third party in the form of Uganda or Rwanda that will take the people in. The problem is that the deal between Israel and the Indian country was under extreme secrecy, and it wasn't really clear whether people will be able to fulfill themselves and get all the benefits and rights as asylum seekers once getting to Uganda and Rwanda. That policy has been exercised for several years, but after immense public pressure and some revelations about the nature of the deal with these countries, which received a lot of public criticism, was put on the back burner and was not really exercised as of 2018. So I know it was a lot of information, but I'm hoping that it provided you with some adequate background about in what situation Israel found itself when all of a sudden a significant influx of asylum seekers came to its territory. With that, I would like to hand it off to my close friend Nouri, who will continue speaking from his lived experience about this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oded. I am so honored to be here, and good evening, everyone. I thank the opportunity to talk to you today about my personal and my collective experience as asylum seeker in the state of Israel. But I would rather give a little bit background about where I did come from. I came from Darfur, the state that incorporated to Sudan by Anglo-Egyptian forces in 1916 during the First World War. And since then, we became Sudanese under the central government affairs as a state. In 2003, which was the peak of the conflict of Darfur, which started back in the mid of 1983, 84. And it was a conflict on resources due to the desertification and lack of resources. And the government discharged that region for several years because of the civil war that was taking place in South Sudan. So with a lack of resources that were entitled for Darfur people to develop the region fell in a very complicated situation, which led to conflict between groups in Darfur. That conflict led Darfur to 2003 conflict, which we saw the authorities of Sudan, instead of handling the conflict in a way that they can find appropriate solution to the problem and address it politically, they try to make it, like group conflict between two groups. One allied the government, and the other one demands rights for the people of Darfur. And the government entitled those who demand rights for people of Darfur as a rebel to legalize the way of fighting against them as an outlaw citizens of the country. So in between the conflict between the government and the factions that call themselves other revolutionaries from Darfur is the civilian were the target of the Janjaweed militia, which were backed by Khartoum government, and that led to the to the outcome of tortures and burning down villages and attacking the villages with the government forces and the Janjaweed militia. This village here is one of the villages that we used to live before we fled our country. In my case, I fled the country in 1999 during the civil war between South Sudan and North Sudan. In 2003, when the conflict reached to the peak in Darfur, then our villages and our families have to displace to neighboring countries and to the refugee camps. Mostly people of Darfur displaced to IDP camps, and about 2 million people were displaced all over the world. Some of them end up to stop in Egypt as well as in Libya. And in Egypt in 2005, government of Sudan and the rebel movements, Sudan Liberation Movement in South Sudan, were about to reach a comprehensive peace agreement between South Sudan and North Sudan. And our people from Darfur end up under circumstances that they don't have any kind of protection, and the UNHCR was trying to slow down their resettlements and the protection that they have in Egypt. So they don't have any umbrella of protection. They lived in a dangerous condition in Egypt and in Libya. And these two countries were ready to deport back these people to Sudan under the situation of the comprehensive peace agreement is about to reach, and the government should implement a peaceful environment for these refugees while the conflict in Darfur is still taking place. So people from Darfur in Egypt, they decided to demonstrate in Mustafa Mahmoud Park, and 2,000 of Darfurians gathered in Mustafa Mahmoud as a kind of demonstration to raise up awareness and to show that they need a kind of protection, and their life is in danger if they get deported back to Sudan. The Egyptian authorities address this demonstration with violence. Many of the refugees were killed in Mustafa Mahmoud, and some of them were injured. Some of them were sent to prison, and some of them were sadly deported back to Sudan. And that caused these people to find another way to escape from Egypt and to find another stop. And they crossed the border through Sinai Desert to Israel. And here you can see some of the refugees that they came recently to Israeli borders. We see behind them the border guard, and that was how the first refugees from Darfur get into Israel through the Israeli borders at that time. When we get into the border of Israel, we end up into refugee camps, it was handed by the UNHCR and the Israeli Interior Minister, and then we did the first steps of the process of registering the arrivals from the Egypt borders, from Sudanese and other Eritreans. They came through the same border. In 2008, in September, UNHCR closed its doors, and the mandate has moved from the UN to the Israeli authorities, the immigration authorities. And by then we have to renew visas. We have to stay like waiting for the regulations to address our application files, and our asylum-seeking process was end up by getting visas, and that visa is a kind of a paper that says it is a permission for temporary stay in Israel, and it says also it is a conditional release from the prison, and it is not a permit for work. But the Supreme Court does not enforce these laws, and then having these visas was like something that avoid us to go back to the prison and to find a way to look for some jobs to start our life in Israel. So the whole community was starting from the scratch to find their way, like to live the daily life without any kind of begging or needing any help from anybody. So we make some groups to help our community when it comes to shelter, food, and all that stuff. And there is a group shelters that the refugee groups start to establish it. And as well, by that time, the organizations that were working in the field of helping the asylum seekers and refugees, they granted some help to find shelters and group shelters. Under that condition, I started my life in the south side of Israel, in a city called Arad, and there I started to work in an hotel in the kitchen, and I pushed myself like to learn the language as fast as possible so I can adapt and I can help myself and my fellow asylum seekers to find a way how to improve our temporary life until we will get back home. The issue of our asylum seekers to be addressed was, like on a station that we don't know when it will start. So since we are safe, so we can find a way to make a little bit of progress for ourselves to live healthy and maintain the healthy life for our community. That's how we make a group of community leaders to take care about the vulnerable ones, the weak members of the community, that they don't have these, like when we have these visas and all that stuff, it is still advantage for the others that they didn't get it yet. And there is a lot of people coming to Israel through the borders. So in 6 years, working to facilitate the problems of the community by the day in daily life, hoping that there will be any kind of spotlight of hope back home and we can go back home, we end up to get summoned to a new place called Khalod. And that order was issued in 2013. And here I want to tell you the story of the Khalod theater. Maybe it will take all the story that I am telling you now in kind of a rehearsal, which we will be laid backward. So in Khalod Detention Center in 2014, I found myself one of the people who have to start his life there, and it was unlimited for unlimited time, and we have to adapt this. It is a kind of life. We move from unsecure life, now it's safe, but we are in we end up in a detention center that we don't know when it will end, but it's still we have the hope that one day we will get out of that detention center and we will have home and go back to our families that we left. In many cases, we left our families. In my case, I didn't hug my family members for goodbye, and that was, like the painful part for almost now over 25 years. And I think this detention center gave us a shelter and a place to start to think about how does it look like when you start your life in a place that you don't know where we will end up your staying there. So then we teach ourselves that it is better to make this place a healthy place, and we can survive and stay there. And while staying in Kholod, the detention center, we organized our people to groups when it comes to teach ourselves how to adapt the new life in the detention center. During this time, we started to build for ourselves a kind of education system and a group that will take care of the guys whom are sick and they need help, and support the people whom are in need of support. So while we are doing this, some good Israeli friends started to come and visit the detention center. And in these visits, we met a lot of people that they want to know about the detention center from the inside and how does it look like. And these questions were for us like, we live in this detention center. We don't think it is interesting like to describe this one. We want to describe, we want to tell our story, and if you are willing to hear our stories, so we can always start to work together. In that time, Abi Mograbi, who is a documentary film director, he started to come to Kholod and started to ask people some questions, and how does it look like to stay here, and when do you think you can go back home, and all that stuff. And he was trying like to find a way to make a documentary film, and he didn't come by himself. He was accompanied by Khen Alon. He's a scholar in Tel Aviv University. He's a theater director who worked with prisoners in Israeli prisons, and he came up with an idea that we can teach some courses for some courses of theater, and that was when we opened our minds to listen to him. Are you going to teach us courses for like theater courses here in Kholod? And then some of the asylum seekers, they said, what we will do with this? Like if we have these courses, what will come out of these courses? And then we found that is the tool that we need to like to reflect and to explain our story to the Israeli society. And when we started to meet and talk about our stories and the narrative from the side of the Israeli society, we get to a point that now we are on the same ground. We can take this forward through the theater, and we can tell our stories and change and switch roles, and we can play our roles in a different way. So you can play our roles and we will play our roles. We will see how it will work. That way, we found ourselves in the Israeli shoes, and then when we started to understand much better how does it look like to be as a citizen and you hosting in your country a lot of refugees that they came from African countries, some of them called an enemy countries because of their policies towards the state of Israel. And then in the theater rehearsals, we pull out all the background that we came with from our countries, and we tell stories about our countries and how we were discriminated in our countries and how we were oppressed by the government when it comes to our culture background, languages, and all that stuff. And that, give us opportunity to see our stories and our narrative from other people on the stage, and that led us to this.
شققتي أخر نسأل الخديجة في تاني ولا فلان سيدر وتحت مساهم تتكشر إلى بعد تتكشر الأخر أوكي بعد أنا الدور كيف لي أنا الدور أني تودع بسمع أخر شو أهو والدين كيف والدين كيف أفيسا شخانك مغال أزعما أفيسا شخانك مغال أني ودفيسا كيف أبرا خديش أنا وديش نكمل على فيسا شو شوي بيلي خوكي يا شخا خديش ريت بنات نميت كان خلط فريدة فوزي بدخو بدخو اخفري يا شخا فريدة فرفيجي أوكي ألو بساعدة نخو تخلي مخرج في تل أبيب كيف كم سوداني كم غيطايم أتخيل شنو تبوزي كيف تكيد لي ولا كل تبارك أوكي تولي لغايوني بخصوصا أوكي نوالدين كيف أكن سيون أنا وتسجل تدخل أخينا توقود كيف أبلا تهدي أما نكمل علي فيزا أني أخشاف أسول العفو أنا دوسي أنا توفي قدي أنا دوسي لخا أنا كيف حالتي مساعدة بميم زيمون لما
This is one of the rehearsals that we played in Kholot Theater, and by doing these theater rehearsals, we found ourselves in a detention center, but in our minds that give us a hope that and give us hope and freedom that we can tell our stories, we can still do something from this detention center. And since these good people are coming to the detention center, trying to listen to us, then our story will be told to the Israeli society, and we will be able to pass all the experience that we experience, whether in Israel or in our countries, to the Israeli society. In the next short rehearsal, I will show you how we switch roles and how the theater gives us a hope that we can tell more part of our stories to the society, and how can we use a theater as a tool to communicate with a society that we lived in for 6 years, and they didn't hear us. They didn't hear anything good about us. They just hear what they hear in the news, that we are infiltrators, that we are enemies, that we are threat for them, that we came to steal their jobs. But still, we feel the act of generosity and love and solidarity from the Israelis. So that attract us to go furthermore to play these rehearsals, and by the end of this rehearsals and the theater courses, we became a group of theater groups that plays in theaters in Tel Aviv, while we are still in the prison. So the first theater show was after this rehearsal, which put us on a stage as an actors now trying to tell our story through the theater in a drama method.
אסתר.
בת כמה עשר? בוא, קרי, אתה רוצה לשבת? בוא. וואו, יצחק. חמוד הילד שלך.
כן, בן כמה הוא?
מה אתם רוצים? לא לכלב, אבי, לא לכלב לידי. בוא תשחק פה לבד. כן, יופי. שם, כן. לא לכלב לידי.
משחקים.
מה משחקים?
משחקים יחד.
אני לא צריך ילד שלי עם ה...
בואי סיוון, בואי. בואי יאללה.
אחי, בוא אבי.
מה קורה?
מה איתך?
בסדר.
זה פה, מה זה? זה מקום הזה.
מאיפה היה?
לא יודע, אין לי מושג.
שלום.
שלום, איזה עטף לי.
מאיפה אתם?
מפה, משפירא.
כאן.
שפירא.
אתם גרים פה?
כן. זה לא נראה לי ישראל. לא נראה לי. אני אולי זה...
אתם אתיופים?
אנחנו מאריתריאה.
מאריתריאה. מה זה אריתריאה?
קרוב לאתיופיה.
כן?
בת כמה הילדה שלך? מה אתם רוצים באים לפה? אתם גרים פה.
רק משחקים. רק משחקים כאן.
סיוון, לא לקרב.
אסתר,
למה?
מה זה?
תמיד זוז קצת.
למה אתה לא פוחד מהילדים?
בטח שאני פוחד.
זה שחורים מפקידים...
תשמע, אתם עושים, אני שמעתי עליכם, אתם עושים בלאגן, אתם שותים על סמים, מכות, הכל עושים אתם. בחורות שלנו לא יוצאים בלילה, זקנים, הם מפחדים.
אני מפחידה? אני מפחידה?
בטח
למה?
אתם באתם להרוס את השכונה.
לא, רק משחק.
This is how we switch roles, and we put the asylum seekers on the stage in the shoes of each other. Israelis in the shoes of the asylum seekers, and the asylum seekers in the shoes of the Israelis. So we started to understand better the problems that exist in our case as people live in that place, and from that rehearsal, we teach ourselves a lot of stuff that we can do together as a community, and that help us to relieve a lot of pain that we were going through to change the situation in the detention center, and also that help to facilitate the way we looked even at the prison guards, prison service workers, to look at them as a people. We both live in the same situation. So if we make, a space in our hearts to each other, so we can handle the daily life to be better. But the overall situation is not under our control. It is something that is out of our control, and that facilitate our life in that detention center to become more creative, to become more open-minded, and then we felt freedom in the detention center. And after the first theater show, which was played in Kholod, out of the fences, the group attracted many Israelis from Tel Aviv and from other cities in Israel to come to Kholod and to watch how we deliver the story of the Israelis and the asylum seekers on the stage. And it was a wonderful start that opened our minds, our hearts to be so excited to go back to Tel Aviv and play on theater stages in schools, in universities, and even in kibbutz and everywhere, and even in the streets while we were demonstrating against the deportation law, which was entitled to be to Rwanda, Uganda, as a policy of the government to force us to go to third country under the term of voluntary return, which was unsecure for many of the asylum seekers who lived in Israel and who left Israel as well. So they end up going back again to other countries to find another way to get to a safe place. Unfortunately, the conflicts in our countries are still running until today. We have some of the refugees that and asylum seekers who are still living in Israel, but the condition has changed dramatically, and we were not expected even to change the situation that way under all that pressure of not having even the opportunity to tell the story. I'm so happy that I was one of those who were in Kholot and helped our community to make a step forward and to understand all the fears that were in the Israeli society's minds, and we found a middle point to continue our life. And Israel is giving a shelter of a lot of asylum seekers today, and some of them, they went to universities, to high colleges in Israel, and that is our hope that tomorrow they will make a better contribution. And I myself hope that I will be one of those who will contribute to make this world a better place for all of us. And I understand that there is a conflict in Israel, and I was there when there was several times conflict, but when I was in Israel, I understood the conflict from all dimensions better and better much from any kind of news or media, because I was there, I met these people, I was with them with all these conflicts. Today, I am so proud that I went through all these movements, like from being a refugee and being in a detention center, and we came up with an open mind that all this happened for a reason. And the good thing is that we overcome all these challenges. And I am so proud that I met Avi and Khen Alon, and I am so proud that I met Kholot actors from the Israeli side and from the Eritreans. From them, we learned a lot. And Kholot theater group is still active till today, and they are doing a very good attempts like to improve the situation, and we are continuing. Even though I came to Canada, we still in a good communication. We do some rehearsals, and during the COVID time, we played a theater show that helped to release some of the money that were kept from the salaries of asylum seekers in Israel, as an attempt like to make them feel they should leave the country. But that money helped during the COVID, and we are so glad that we overcome all the challenges through these years. Still, our asylum seekers, they live in Israel, and I think today the situation is much more better even the situation when it comes to their asylum applications is not solved completely. Some of them, their situation enhanced, they get a group protection, but I'm glad that they understand that, and every day their life is going forward. Some of them, they end up to come to Canada, and we have a big community all over the world today, from the family that lived in Israel, and today we are a good family and a big family all over the globe. I will give the microphone back to Dr. Oded to continue.
One love. One love, it's a word in Tigrinya.
Thank you very much, Nouri. We're almost out of time, so I just want to wrap up kind of like and build on Nouri's last point with the last 60 seconds before we go to the Q&A. So according to data published in December 2021, recently, there are still over 28,000 asylum seekers in Israel. In short, I would say that Israel decided not to decide. It's not very clear what will be the future and for these people, because their asylum process is still somewhat stalled, and the recognition rate, if you look in a global comparison, is still remains very, very low. The community, as you noticed, I presented in one of the first slides of 64,000 has shrunk to less than 30,000. The reason is the majority of the people who left Israel over the last 5 years were reunited with families abroad in Europe, in Canada, in other places, and were able to find their just asylum outside of Israel. And I think it begs the moral question that if they were able to make the case abroad, what does it mean, and what role does Israel have to play to make sure that they might even get status in Israel one day, because clearly they have a case. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been taken by other countries. So that is something that we're hopefully will be resolved, and that the Israeli will take a stand. We're happy to take more questions about this specific topic in the Q&A. My final point is that if you want to stay connected to this issue, you're welcome to scan this QR code or follow these links. These are human rights organizations doing holy work, working and supporting in every sense of the way the lives of asylum seekers in Israel. And you can also follow the theater, which is still active and recently has gone back to in-person performances as COVID eases. So we both want to thank you so much for your time today and for being with us to learn about this important issue, important to us and hopefully important to you as well. And we look forward to taking some questions as part of the Q&A. So thank you very much.